Good morning, Wabash. Our speaker today is Dr. Eric Freeze, not to be confused with Mr. Freeze, Batman's nemesis, Eric the Iceman Freeze, an Inuit Stampede wrestler, or the other Dr. Freeze, his spouse. He hails from southern Alberta, Canada, completed his PhD in fiction writing from Ohio University, and is currently Byron Kitely Trippett Assistant Professor of English at Wabash College. He has published articles, reviews, translations, and short stories in several journals, including most recently the Southern Review and the New Ohio Review. Please welcome Dr. Eric Freeze for his chapel talk, Ultimate Frisbee, Doppelgangers, and the Woman Inside Me.
Okay. I'd like to thank everyone for the chance I have to speak today. I've really enjoyed my time so far teaching at Wabash College, and I think environments like this are some of the unique things about this place. I thought I'd start my talk today by contextualizing a little bit where I'm coming from. I have a good friend of mine who is always teasing me that I make too much about my being Canadian. But I think it might help for understanding where this talk is going to go. Sometimes I feel a little bit like my colleague Warren Rosenberg, who's fond of saying, "I didn't know I was Jewish until I moved to the Midwest." You know, and I feel sometimes similar. You know, I didn't really know I was Canadian until I moved to the Midwest. So anyways, but like the United States, Canada is a very big country and has a lot of different cultures that exist in Canada. Southern Alberta, for example, where I come from, is very different from maybe the stereotype of Canada that most people would have. A stereotype that I'm actually sometimes fond of perpetuating. You know, here's a few stereotypes or examples. You know, Canada, green-loving, peaceful country where littering is a crime. Everyone is recognized as a distinct part of a rich cultural mosaic. You know, there's also stereotypes about free health care and, you know, gun control, huge natural resources, hockey, curling, beer, Celine Dion, William Shatner. Anyways, those elements are there, but they're very different than the area of the country that I come from, which is southern Alberta. I'm from a small town, about 3,000 people, that has a few kind of different groups that live in it. There's groups called Hutterites that are sort of similar to Luddites. Or have Luddite roots, but they're these communal groups that are predominantly farming based, and they're similar kind of to the Amish. And then there's a large population of Mormons in southern Alberta, and large Native American population as well. There's one of the largest Native American reservations in North America near where I'm from. So anyways, it's a very different kind of a place, and a place that wasn't always the kind of happy, politically correct, tolerant environment, I guess, that we often associate with Canada. And, you know, difference in this area was often punished. And I think there's a few different reasons for this. One was, I think, that it was a very male-dominated space. It's something that we're a little bit sensitive to here at Wabash. Very male-dominated space. You know, for example, all of my high school teachers were male. You know, this was a very small high school, granted, but you know, all of my high school teachers were male, and almost all of them, with maybe one or two exceptions, coached one of the high school sports teams. So, you know, in this space, it was a space that I resisted in a lot of ways, and in some ways didn't really fit in, and experienced some of the kind of discrimination, I think, that can exist in a space like this firsthand. You know, for example, I didn't like sports, or I did like sports, but I didn't play the sports that were privileged by that society. You know, I played ultimate Frisbee, or I played soccer, you know, and those weren't sports that were really recognized. I mean, the big sports there were either football, hockey, or basketball. I played instruments, you know, I wrote poetry, lots of really, really bad love poems in high school. And this would often lead to some interesting tensions. You know, I'd often have people wanting to beat me up. There was a high level of homophobia in the little town. I had, you know, one guy who would repeatedly, you know, come up to me and you know, say all of these very, very negative things, you know, saying that I was homosexual and that he was going to beat me up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So anyways, not a very tolerant space. Because of this, I think because of those formative experiences, I became very sensitive to, I guess, people who didn't fit the mold of a dominant society, and became very sensitive also to how, you know, sometimes there are institutional forms of misogyny or discrimination that can perpetuate these kinds of problems. So, what does this have to do with Wabash? First off, I don't want this to. I don't think my talk is really trying to criticize Wabash in any way. I've been very impressed since I've been at Wabash with the level of discussion that occurs here on campus, the level of discussion that these types of chapel talks, for example, have generated, where people are talking about masculinity, talking about this context, and seeing how it influences us. And that's probably the most integral part of my chapel talk today that I'd like to get at, is how inclusion, how trying to understand others is one of the most important parts of what a liberal arts education can be. And perhaps I can explain a little bit more about this by sharing another personal anecdote. When I started my undergraduate, you know, I came from this very masculine space, right? Resisting that space a little bit. When I got to my undergraduate, I ended up trying, in some ways, I think, to resist that space by seeking out other voices and other experiences. And you know, for example, through most of my undergraduate and graduate careers, my mentors were women. The thesis chair for my master's thesis, I did a master's thesis on Julie Dash, an African-American writer and screenwriter, filmmaker. Did it on Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust, and it was Gloria Cronin was my chair, excellent mentor, really influential. Joan Connor was my chair for my dissertation, again extremely influential for me. And I think one of the reasons is because as an undergraduate, I was very much drawn to, I guess, what you would call feminine texts. I was drawn to texts by women, often texts by minority writers as well. And largely, I think, because they expressed a similar kind of shared victimization, something that I felt I identified with, you know, a shared othering by a dominant culture. And this was something that I felt I understood kind of on a gut level. You know, I'd never really go so far as to say that I essentially understood these texts or that I completely understood these texts. You know, I couldn't understand exactly what the characters went through, but there was something essential about them. And I think it is that kind of that othering aspect, that victimization that I identified with. You know, I remember, you know, with great clarity, for example, the first time I read Zora Neale Hurston's "Their Eyes Were Watching God," or Toni Morrison's "Beloved," or Margaret Atwood's "Surfacing." These were, for me, sort of my canonical formative texts. Now, I felt something in these texts, I think, that I didn't feel in more canonical mainstream texts. And I found myself submerging myself in these texts that spoke from the margins, that tried to reposition an audience, that tried to speak for a group, that for whatever reason wasn't privileged by the dominant culture. Now, why did I choose to do this? Why wasn't I drawn to like texts written by other white men, people from my same subject position? Why wasn't I reading Hunter S. Thompson or Raymond Carver or even Hemingway? Well, I was reading these people, but I was reading them, I think, often with the lens of another group or an othered or minority or marginal group. When I was in graduate school, for example, one of my professors told me we would have these long discussions about the texts that we were reading, and at one point over the semester, he said, you read texts like a black woman, and I was like, okay. And it's because it was because I was always identifying stereotypes. I was always looking at how male authors marginalize minority characters for the purposes of characterization of their white counterparts. Zora Neale Hurston said famously that the black woman was the mule of the world, forced to bear the burdens of miscegenation and slavery. And in literature, these same burdens often express themselves in different ways through the literary imagination of white authors. You look at a number of these more canonical white male texts, and often their worlds are populated by mammies, Sambos, Uncle Tom characters, and these characters are often forced to bear the burden of the plot. Enabling whatever the white narrative is. Toni Morrison, who we're reading in my American literature class right now, and I think several of you who are in C&T or have been in C&T have read. And, she argues that to read American literature is to read the literature of the new white male. Okay, and what I think is interesting about this statement is that it's very different from what my experience was. My experience, I was learning to read like a black woman. So there you have it. That's the woman inside me. Since these experiences, I've tried to continue to expand my notion of what reading can do. I think one of the reasons that I was drawn to these texts is, one, there was a kind of personal or emotional identification that I had there, but also I think because it expanded my worldview. Okay, it allowed me to see things from others' perspectives in ways that I wouldn't have been able to before. And I want to be a little bit careful about this. I don't want to sound like I'm essentializing the experiences of another. I can learn to read like a minority or a marginalized author, but I can never be a minority or marginalized author. I can't essentialize the experiences of another. I can't say that I'm another person, but I think that I have an obligation to try and see things from others' perspectives. So this was one of the most empowering and wonderful things for me about reading. And it's something that's continued to shape my literary imagination. I think as an author, I'm very conscious about the act of appropriation. Any imaginative act, if I'm writing a character, I'm trying to imagine their experiences. I'm trying to put it down in words on the page. And, reading from a variety of different subject positions, or reading about a variety of different subject positions, has made me become a lot more sensitive to others in my own work. It's also helped me see the varieties of multiplicity and meaning that we get. Signifying is a concept that I think is wonderful in African American literature, where it's you have authors who are saying two things at once. There's a multiplicity of meaning in the text. And I think, through the act of reading, we're actually becoming multiple, actually learning to see multiple selves or multiple ways of developing meaning. Just having a name, Dr. Freeze, this was a little bit in my my bio that Kyle read, but just having the name Dr. Freeze, I'm keenly aware of the multiplicity and the slipperiness of language, right? I mean, Dr. Freeze has multiple iterations and multiple meanings. I've seen, Dr. Freeze represented in a blue Arnold Schwarzenegger, up on the big screen. Or the one example that I share that probably needs a little bit more contextualization, but is Eric the Iceman Freeze, who was a professional wrestler in Alberta. And actually, if you Google my name, there's two Dr. Freeze, well, there's two Eric Freezes that'll show up. It's Eric Freeze, Eric the Iceman Freeze. And we're both from Alberta, but one looks like me, and the other one looks like three of me, with a very salient jaw and biceps about the size of my head. I'm often mistaken for this guy on the street. But anyways, it's made me aware of the slipperiness of language and how we can be multiple. So I think it's important to try and read a variety of different texts so that we're able to understand other positions, so that we're able to be multiple and understand our own multiplicity. And I think this is something that is essential to what a liberal arts education is. Seeing things from the point of view of an other, to try and recognize the other, to recognize that there are these variety of perspectives, these variety of worldviews out there, and realizing, that we may never get there. We may never understand the other. I think it's ultimately we're never going to be able to truly understand another's experience. But I think that we have an obligation to try, and that obligation is central to a liberal arts education. Which brings me to ultimate Frisbee. Okay, now this next part is kind of, I think, a metaphor for what I've been talking about so far in my talk. And, you can read it as a metaphor, you can read it maybe just as a funny tangential example of what I'm talking about. But for me, ultimate has always been this kind of very democratic, inclusive space. I don't know if you know a little bit of the history of the game at all, but I mean, even to this day, there's some vestiges of it in the way that people play the sport. But it's very democratic. It's always self-refereed. It's incredibly inclusive. It's kind of got a come-as-you-are type vibe to it. Some of the groups that I played ultimate Frisbee with, we never kept score because it wasn't important to win. It was just important to be there together as a community. So anyways, I think it demonstrates in some ways some of the things that I'm talking about. And there's also something that I found, there's a kind of gender-bending vibe about ultimate Frisbee that I find interesting as well. One of the groups that I played with was a group of students at Bradley University, and they would routinely wear skirts, both the men and the women. But it was this environment where it was okay to do that. It was kind of like they were playing with the codes that we wear on our bodies and subverting them in kind of interesting ways. So this is called Why I Play Ultimate Frisbee, and I'm just going to read it, and then afterwards I'm going to chuck a frisbee out into the crowd because I think that would be cool. No other reason. Okay, why I play ultimate Frisbee. You're at a park. It's roughly 70 degrees outside, just warm enough so that you can be wearing shorts and cool enough that you can run without overheating or working up too much of a sweat. There is low humidity, and you've checked the forecast on weather.com, and the local news says that the weather should stay that way, that you'll have your sun, your nice moderate temperatures, and dry conditions for the whole afternoon. And this is important. No wind. And those of you who play Ultimate know what I mean. You take your place on the field. There are several others here to play. A tall mechanical engineer whose size 15 cleats look like the treads of earth movers, a 40-something chemistry professor with a t-shirt that reads Longfellow Ultimate, quieting the existential hum since 1979. A 12-year-old kid with a movie star name like Jace, and a group of college kids wearing skirts. Yes, skirts. The college kids are from every major and background imaginable. There's a business major with sunglasses and a ponytail wearing a purple tie-dye skirt that comes to his knees, an education major who has the size and speed of a running back but wears a green miniskirt with frills, and an English major who wears a kind of lava with a Hawaiian orchid print. There are other players too. A guy who works for Row Heating and Air Conditioning, the two girls who own the new ice cream place downtown, and the solo guitarist who has gigs on the weekend and who can only come half of the time. And everybody plays. You divide up into teams. You'll be with the engineer guy and the 12-year-old, the ice cream girls, the air conditioning guy and the guitarist. The college kids, Mr. Ponytail and his skirt-clad friends, make up the other team. They're throwing to you and start off with a cheer. They're in a circle and they hold the disc, the Frisbee, with their thumbs and chant, El Camino, El Camino. The front is like a car and the back is like a truck. El Camino, El Camino. The front is like a car and the back is where you put stuff. This was a chant that they would do frequently. You line up against the other team. You'll be guarding Mr. Ponytail. The throw is backhand, inside out with good spin, and it flies true, curving around to your end zone where the engineer picks it up and brings it into play. You stack up, and each of the guys cuts out until he has a clear throw. They're forcing forehand, forcing street, but the engineer is experienced and has those long arms to reach past his defender. He passes to one of the ice cream girls, and she dishes it back to the guitarist. The 12-year-old is already up the field and waving his arms like he's doing the YMCA. You cut left and right trying to shake Mr. Ponytail, and when you do get the Frisbee, it's only in your hands for a second before you let it fly to the kid who pancakes it, then catches it on a dive. So you've made a point. You're happy, sure, but it's not important. You all know the rules of the game because you played it together on and off for the past several years. You've seen this college professor's kid grow up, go through high school, and move east. When the guitarist took his gig around the country, you were there when he got back. The college kids have come and gone, the skirts going in and out of style. On days when there are fewer, the skirts stay in their backpacks, gathering mold. The point is, you keep playing. In the game now, the skirts are up, you think, but you have to ask around to be sure. The numbers are there to measure your collective progress. 13 will mark the end of this game, 7 the next. At halftime, you'll sit on the sidelines and drink water and talk about the plays, the running back's long huck to the English major, or the time Ponytail caught the disc off the engineer's block. The 12-year-old amazes all of you by being everywhere you're not. He's young, doesn't have the skills to throw yet, but he has glue-like hands that make him dangerous. You speculate about his future. When he's older, you say, and in each of your minds he is a world champion, a gifted athlete who will play in college, who will introduce the sport to the Olympics. Near the end of the game, the engineer throws a hammer, and you've lost Ponytail. You're 3 strides ahead of him, and in the end zone, and the disc flies in, inverted, so you can see the spinning black lines of the disc's logo. It's coming in hard and fast, and your legs are pumping, the lactic acid building up in your quads and glutes. Then there's that moment, that one moment, where you let go of all rational thought, and your feet leave the ground, and you're sailing through the air with your arm out, waiting for the spinning disc to meet flesh before it hits the ground. Is it a catch, or just a dive in the dirt? Your hand is open, your thumb extended. There is the disc, the setting sun, the trampled grass, the skirts and humidity. You may never know. All you can do is reach. The end. Whoa. Thank you.